In today's module, let's discuss the best types of carbs. As you can now tell from the course, carbs are a very important macronutrient for optimal metabolic health. Properly oxidizing carbohydrates is the way to regain metabolic health, as proper carb burning increases endogenous CO2, carbon dioxide production. And due to something called the Bohr and Haldane effect, more CO2 improves oxygen delivery to the cells, which then allows fats to burn better because fats require a lot of oxygen to burn. Carbs also increase NAD+ levels, and higher NAD+ allows metabolites to move through the electron transport chain better, generating more ATP, which is the definition of a better metabolism. But what are the best types of carbs? Let's discuss that in today's module. So as you can see in this chart, there are many different types, but the two main categories are simple and complex. Simple have a very simple chemical structure and are either monosaccharides, a single sugar molecule like glucose or fructose, or disaccharides, two sugar molecules linked together like sucrose or lactose in milk. These carbs are generally pretty easy for your body to digest. Think of ripe fruit, fruit juice, honey, sugar, and maple syrup. And all of these items that I just mentioned, they contain a different combination of these different types of simple sugars. Complex carbs are made of longer, more complex chains of sugar molecules, including oligosaccharides and polysaccharides. So these complex carbs take longer to digest than simple carbs, and these will be present in starches like rice, potatoes, and bread. Now, which carbs are better? You have some people telling you that all starches are horrible, and then you have other people saying fructose in fruit is poison. Well, we think the answer is found more in the middle, where both starches and sucrose sources can and should be a part of your diet. This is what our ancestors did. If you reflect back on what our great-great-grandmas ate, it was both starches and sucrose sources. Bread, potatoes, flour, rice, corn flour, sometimes oats, sometimes beans. They're starch sources. And then also sucrose sources like apples, sugar, in-season fruit, maple syrup, and honey. Here, in fact, is a grocery list from 1882. Carb sources included potatoes, bread, or flour, sugar, in addition to whatever in-season fruit or vegetables that were available at the store. Neither carb source is bad, and our goal in this section is to educate you on the different types of carbs to empower and encourage you to experiment for yourself. And being aware of the different types can help you better understand the amount of each that works well for you. And remember, being aware of food choices gets rid of food fear, because then you kind of better understand things. And then at the end of this section, we will provide tips to help you better understand what ratio of those complex versus simple sugars works better for you. Before diving into more of the science and the why, let's just briefly cover the best types of carbs. Typically, the best tolerated carbs include well-cooked starches like rice, sourdough bread, oats for some people, masa harina, well-cooked roots and tubers, which include potatoes, sweet potatoes, yam, cassava, or beets, ripe fruits. Ripe is very important. Unripe fruits can cause digestive problems. Frozen fruits often work well too, which you can use in things like smoothies or to stew up to make your own marmalades and jams, as frozen fruits are often picked when ripe and then frozen. Fruit juices like orange, grape, apple, cherry, mango, etc. Marmalades, so the peel of citrus fruit is the best source of these two polyphenols called naringenin and naringenin, which are potent anti-inflammatory, antioxidant, and have anti-cancer effects. Sweeteners like honey, cane sugar, maple syrup, etc. Fruit vegetables like squashes, tomatoes, cucumbers, zucchini, and pumpkin. And for some people, well-cooked, low-fat beans work on occasion. Here's also a brief overview of how we view the function and benefits of each type of carb, so starches, fruits, sweeteners, and vegetables. So for starches, they help us increase the NAD+ pool the most relative to sucrose, which will lower reductive stress and boost metabolism. You have longer blood sugar regulation due to the more complex molecules. It's a dense energy and calorie source. So if you are someone that is needing to get 2,800, 3,000 calories, try fitting that all in just getting fruits and fruit juices. It'll be hard to do. Starches are a good way for us to get good energy. Starches increase muscle glycogen the most, which helps with muscle building and sends a signal of homeostasis and safety to the body. And many people don't realize this, but they actually are nutrient dense. So potatoes are a great source of vitamin B6, copper, potassium, and other minerals. And sourdough bread and some other grains are a great source of B vitamins. Next up, fruit and fruit juice. So these contain more of the simple sugars like glucose, fructose, and sucrose. When ripe, they are easy to digest. And fructose helps us refill liver glycogen the most, which is super helpful for a variety of systems across the body. Fruit often contains health-promoting polyphenols, which are very good for the gut microbiome and help activate the body's natural antioxidant pathway. Fruit contains high levels of minerals like potassium, a great mineral source. And fruit also contains fiber, which is beneficial for the gut as long as we have good gut motility. The gut bacteria can ferment the fiber and generate short-chain fatty acids, which is then the energy source for our gut lining cells, which can improve energy production in our gut, and it can better maintain structure and function. Next up would be sweeteners like honey, maple syrup, and sugar. So truthfully, these can help us give us energy. They contain minerals. Raw honey contains some enzymes, and honestly, they're delicious. That is an important part of them as well. And the last category, vegetables. So vegetables contain fiber and vitamins like vitamin K1 and some other health-promoting polyphenols. But it's important to realize that vegetables aren't really a dense carb source. So you can't just eat vegetables on your plate. You wouldn't get enough carbs and energy. That's where people come into problems when they just eat a bunch of vegetables, because it's not a dense energy source. We need to consume energy for our body as well. So you will hear a lot about how bad vegetables are these days in like the carnivore space and things like that. But vegetables aren't bad when they're well cooked. Where you'll run into problems, like I mentioned, is if you're on a vegetable-based diet. You'll be consuming a high fiber, low energy diet. And our cells need energy macros like carbs to generate sufficient ATP. With a high fiber, low energy diet, this can lead to a lot of gut problems since the gut doesn't have the energy to move that fiber through. So this is where a lot of excess fiber consumption can rot and ferment, causing overgrowth and a bunch of gas. So just to dial this point in, let's compare a potato, asparagus, red pepper, and cucumber. Potato is a nutrient-rich and energy-dense plant, just like sweet potatoes. So here I have listed the amount of carbs per 100 grams. So that's that bright blue column on the left. So potatoes have about 18 grams of carbs per 100 grams, whereas asparagus, red pepper, and cucumber are a lot less. So again, these like vegetables are not very energy dense. They don't contain a ton of carbohydrates. That doesn't make them not useful, but they just aren't an energy source. Veggies like asparagus, peppers, cucumbers, green beans, broccoli, Brussels sprouts, etc., they're more of a nutrient and fiber and water source. In fact, the water in veggies and fruits is, interestingly, naturally structured by nature. So just wanted to share this screen and this comparison so that you don't fill your plate entirely with asparagus or entirely with just veggie leaves. It's okay to have those on your plate, but they shouldn't be the main part of your plate. We need energy and obviously some protein and fat too. So again, don't fear veggies as they can contain beneficial nutrients, add a lot of taste to meals, but don't let them fill your entire plate, and definitely do not consume a bunch of raw veggies. Raw carrots are an exception due to their unique fibers. So ensure your veggies are well cooked, but our favorite way to utilize veggies is to include them in soups and stews, like a beef stew, oxtail beef stew, or you can try out something called the Hippocrates soup and enjoy that with some meat on the side, a very mineral and vitamin K1 rich soup. Now, while we think carb consumption is absolutely necessary, we must remember that we are all unique. Everyone will react to different carb sources differently. And how you handle certain foods depends on your gut health. For example, someone may tolerate oranges just fine. Others may react negatively to the pulp fibers in oranges, and so they may tolerate orange juice better. Some people may tolerate sourdough just fine, while others will be a little sensitive to any intake of gluten at this point in time. Our gut changes as we change our diet day to day, but it's important to remember that when adding in a new carb source, add that in very slowly to gauge response and slowly increase the amount over time so your body can adjust. Remember, the body likes homeostasis, and adding a ton of a new food at one time may not be the best idea. Instead, for example, try out like half a potato or 1/4 cup of orange juice, and then slowly work up as you add new things. But finding what carb sources from each of those categories that we've reviewed that you like is easy for you to incorporate in your regular diet and your body digests well, that's going to be really important. So throughout the rest of this module, we'll discuss some carb concerns in hopes to reduce your food fear. We all need less food fear in our lives. Literally, the act of fearing a food can interfere with the digestion of that food. So we'll cover a little bit more of the science behind different types of carbs like fruits, sugar, and fructose. We'll cover starches, benefits, types, and concerns. We'll cover some resistant starches, and then we'll end with some important notes and tips with including carbohydrates. First up, sugar, or otherwise known as sucrose. There are many different types of sugars, like we mentioned: glucose, galactose, fructose, lactose, and sucrose. Real whole foods do not contain one single type. It's always a balance. And yes, that even includes sugar. Our ancestors regularly consumed sugar. Even indigenous tribes sucked the sugar out of the sugarcane plant. Sugar contains sucrose, and sucrose is a disaccharide, a 2 polymer, that breaks down into half glucose and half fructose. It is 50-50 glucose-fructose. Sugar in the wrong context can, of course, be problematic. For example, someone consumes a bunch of sugar with a lot of PUFAs, or they consume a bunch of sugar in abundance without consuming a nutrient-dense diet, because processing that sugar requires a lot of micronutrients. It's about consuming sugar in an intelligent way in the context of a nutrient-dense diet where you can see benefits. And of course, you don't have to include sugar itself. You can also instead use maple syrup or honey. Again, both starches and sugars are good. Just wanted to show a little spectrum here of what's considered more starchy versus what's considered more sucrose. So on the top, we've got high starch, almost pure glucose. That's going to be things like potatoes, rice, sourdough bread, oats, and grains. Then in the middle, more medium starch. That's going to include winter squashes and actually some sweet potato varieties, as some sweet potato varieties contain a little more sugar and starches. And then the bottom of the starch spectrum, no starch, higher in sucrose or fructose. Summer squashes, fruits and fruit juices, honey, maple syrup, and sugar. So again, what we're talking about right now is the more higher in sucrose sources like fruits and sweeteners and fruit juices. So when sugar, sucrose, is used in the context of an overall well-balanced diet, there's some well-documented benefits. So first, sucrose replenishes liver glycogen better than glucose or starch. So with a well-fed liver, this will help raise the metabolic rate because this will increase the T4 to T3 conversion that occurs in the liver and improve thyroid function. It will also protect against estrogen dominance because suboptimal liver function promotes estrogen excess, as does suppressed thyroid metabolism and digestion. Endotoxin and other inflammatory stress substances promote a rise in estrogen levels. So by fueling the liver, it can improve its function and digestion. So sugar encourages the detoxification and excretion of estrogen that occurs in the liver, powerfully protecting against estrogen dominance. Second, the consumption of sucrose lowers the stress response, which we are all bombarded with in modern times. And third, sucrose promotes the production of protective hormones like pregnenolone and progesterone and protects against nitric oxide, the metabolic poison, serotonin, histamine, and lactic acid. So it protects against all of that. So what about fructose? So again, sucrose is 50-50 glucose fructose. What about fructose? There's so much food fear about fructose, about how it's a poison. So yes, sugar sources contain fructose, and fructose alone can be problematic. But there are no pure fructose sources in nature. You will never consume a whole food that contains 100% fructose. Even table sugar is 50-50 fructose glucose. So the vilification of sugar and fructose is reminiscent of the unscientific demonization of saturated fat in the literature that fears saturated fat and cholesterol. But eating sugar in balance with other foods can be a useful support for the metabolism. Most of the anti-fructose studies out there, here's a quote from the literature, quote, they've employed dietary instruction, sometimes with fructose supplementation, and have not established adequate control of nutrient intake. To define metabolic effects, investigators must provide foods to study participants and regularly control the intake of all nutrients, end quote. So most of these anti-fructose studies have just allowed the mice or subjects to just eat as much as possible, and they've created lab conditions that are not achievable in a balanced diet when you eat real food, as again, there's no pure fructose in nature. Here's a quote from literature, quote, negative conclusions have been drawn from studies in rodents or in humans attempting to elucidate the mechanisms and biological pathways underlying fructose consumption by using unrealistically high fructose amounts, end quote. Here's one more quote from the literature, quote, studies that have suggested a link between fructose consumption and NAFLD, non-alcoholic fatty liver disease, have been criticized on a variety of grounds. Studies employ conditions that differ markedly from the way fructose is normally consumed in the human diet. Some, in animals or humans, employed large doses of pure fructose not normally consumed in the human diet, or used bolus dosages at higher levels than humans typically consume. Fructose at levels consumed by up to 90% of the population in sucrose and other sweeteners does not result in increased liver fat or intramuscular adipose tissue accumulation, end quote. Of course, any overconsumed macronutrient will lead to problems. But again, pure fructose simply doesn't exist in nature, and pure fructose is often used in these studies. So you can't really replicate some of these conditions with a normal diet. Plus, pure fructose, which again doesn't exist in real food, is not absorbed well on its own. Malabsorbed fructose goes on to feed endotoxins in the gut, and this explains all the negative results of pure fructose, which is commonly fed in a lot of these experiments. However, fructose absorption and utilization improves when fructose is consumed in combination with glucose and amino acids. For those who have a limited capacity to absorb certain amounts of fructose, co-ingestion with glucose increases intestinal absorption capacity for fructose. It's almost like Mother Nature knows that it has to combine the two. So I include links to a bunch of meta-analyses and studies basically showing that moderate fructose consumption has no deleterious effects on lipid and glucose control. So we can let go of fructose food fear. So here are some important benefits to fructose inclusion in a diet. So again, just consuming foods that contain fructose as one of its types of carbohydrates in it. So first, fructose does not require insulin to be used by the cell. Fructose and glucose metabolism differ. Fructose can enter the cell without insulin, producing a smaller postprandial rise in glucose and insulin levels relative to other carbohydrates, which, that isn't always a bad thing, but this can be helpful for some people. So studies in diabetic subjects performed in the 1970s and 1980s demonstrated that fructose-containing test meals produce smaller postprandial increases in glucose levels than test meals containing isocaloric amounts of sucrose, glucose, and starch. Fructose inclusion has been shown to improve the glycemic response to an oral glucose load without significantly enhancing the insulin or triglyceride response. This also means that the liver doesn't have to expend energy to metabolize it. So here's a quote from the literature, quote, we found a significant reduction in glycemic and insulin responses when sugar replaced the rapidly digested starch in a processed breakfast cereal, the opposite of what is commonly believed, end quote. Fructose can also help us better utilize glucose. Here's a quote from Dr. Ray Peat, quote, fructose catalyzes the ability to use glucose efficiently. Fructose also improves mineral balance relative to other carbs. Fructose is protective to the cell and prevents hypoxic cell death in the liver. Fructose improves alcohol clearing from the blood. Fructose ingestion increases thermogenesis and increases the resting metabolic rate, i.e. calorie burning. As we've discussed, fructose replenishes liver glycogen stores faster than glucose. And liver glycogen is what allows the liver to perform better and convert T4 into active thyroid hormone T3. Fructose consumption also increases serum CO2 levels, which is what we want. So the beauty of fruit, why we love fruit. Fruit is an easy to digest energy source when ripe and in season. It's a great source of minerals and beneficial polyphenols. Fruit contains a lot of potassium, which has insulin-like activity to improve glucose absorption without having to secrete as much insulin. It's void of anti-nutrients found in many greens and seeds, and it is delicious, probably by design. When a fruit is fully ripened, the disaccharide, double sugar molecule, sucrose, is broken down easily into fructose and glucose, single sugar molecules, requiring very little digestive strength. The same is true for raw honey and well-cooked root vegetables. This makes sugar an especially excellent carbohydrate choice for those with digestive issues or for those who are suffering from bloating, because the more complex the carbohydrate, the more digestive strength required. Unripe fruit, however, is really not a good option. This can be hard to digest since unripe fruits contain more pectin than ripe fruit, and so it's really best to stick with ripe fruit that is in season, or use fruit juices, frozen fruit, or marmalades. If you do have unripe fruit, you can try to stew it. So the higher amount of pectin can make it a great option for homemade jam and jelly, which helps thicken it. Slice into small chunks, add to a pot, add a dash of water and some maple syrup or honey, some cinnamon if desired, and bring that liquid to a boil, then reduce to a low simmer and cover until the liquid has largely evaporated and the fruit is soft. And that can take, 5 to 20, 30 minutes, depending on how unripe and how much fruit you added to the pot. Another great sucrose source is fruit juice like orange juice. Why orange juice? Mainstream keto world is very wrong calling orange juice liver poison. Orange juice does not negatively impact lipids, body weight, or insulin sensitivity. I have the references in the PDF module below. One study actually showed it improved lipid profiles. Orange juice is almost perfectly balanced with glucose and fructose. It contains a lot of minerals. For example, it's jam-packed with potassium, and also contains a number of beneficial polyphenols that are anti-inflammatory. It actually reduces the levels and effects of inflammation induced by endotoxins. In fact, inclusion in a meal prevented meal-induced oxidative and inflammatory stress, including the increases in endotoxin and TLR expression, end quote. Pulp-free orange juice does not contain any fibers that could disrupt the gut, so for someone who has a lot of gut issues, orange juice would be a great carb to regularly include. However, it's also totally fine to eat the orange as well. Before moving on to starches, let's discuss a very common fear-mongering point against sugar, and that is the formation of AGEs, advanced glycation end products, which are harmful compounds when in excess in the body. So many people say that sugar increases AGE. However, there is no evidence that fructose accelerates protein glycation. And I, again, include references in the module PDF below. Here's a quote from the literature, quote, "Rapid clearance of plasma fructose after dietary fructose ingestion makes it unlikely that fructose would have time to affect protein glycation significantly," end quote. Again, fructose is pretty readily and quickly absorbed. The name glycation indicates the addition of sugar groups to proteins, and this occurs in diabetes and old age. But when tested in a controlled experiment, lipid peroxidation of polyunsaturated fatty acids, PUFAs, produces this protein damage about 23 times faster than simple sugars do. It is the decomposition of PUFAs, not fructose, that is the major problem for AGEs, advanced glycation end products. Plus, the effects of AGEs are minimized when you have elevated CO2 levels inside of your body, and you can get higher CO2 levels from proper carb burning and a strong metabolism. So next up, let's transition to starches. Starches can get a bad rep in some health camps and even in the pro-metabolic space. But if you study traditional cultures, most, if not all, had a dietary starch staple, like cassava, rice, potatoes, corn, or wheat. Here are just a few examples. First, ugali. This is the staple of Kenyan cuisine, and it is corn flour mixed with water that has a consistency of bread dough. Next up, farofa. And this is a Brazilian dish made using toasted cassava. Authentic corn tortillas made by ancient Mayans using masa harina flour. That's just, we'll talk about that here shortly. It's a corn flour. Something called bannock, B-A-N-N-O-C-K. And this was a biscuit made by Inuits in northern Canada. Again, the keto people will tell you that they only ate whale blubber, but they went out of their way to find starches. So bannock can now be made with grains and cornmeal, some of the recipes, but it was originally made from starchy root vegetables that they would forage for. Starches were centerpieces of a number of traditional cultures, and many areas in Africa contain abundant tubers. And yes, the age of industrial agriculture brought us starchy grains like wheat. However, roots and tubers, which are starches, were all heavily utilized pre-agriculture for thousands of years. The amylase enzyme, which is required for us to break down starches, is thought to have played a key role in human evolution in allowing humans a calorie-rich alternative to fruit and protein. Remember, humans require energy to perform all of our tasks and functions, and starches provide a dense energy source, allowing us to produce more ATP. Here's a quote from this study here, quote, "We provide evidence that cooked starch, a source of preformed glucose, greatly increase energy availability to human tissues with high glucose demands, such as the brain, red blood cells, and the developing fetus," end quote. The ability to digest starch, along with the discovery of fire and cooking, gave humans a new food source that allowed us to thrive even in marginal environments. Some scientists have even argued that the consumption of starch, along with meat, was primarily responsible for the increase in our brain size. The problem is that many of the modern American starch sources are crappy. For example, modern bread can include the use of a lot of PUFA-rich vegetable oils. Pasta dishes often use pesticide-rich flour that's fortified with iron shards, and the pasta sauces often include PUFA-rich vegetable oils. Similarly, most pizzas are made using pesticide-rich flour that's fortified with iron shards, and again, PUFA-rich vegetable oils that are included in the pizza preparation. Non-organic oats and wheat contain some of the highest levels of glyphosate, since this is a common practice in non-organic grain agriculture. They spray glyphosate a few weeks before harvest to kill the plants, so that way they can push harvest a few weeks earlier. These are not things that our ancestors dealt with. So cooking your meals, using real ingredients, and sourcing quality starches is, of course, very important. So let's just check out the ingredient list of Wonder Bread. It's fortified flour that's likely rich in glyphosate. It contains soybean oil and a bunch of stabilizers and preservatives. Yuck. Very similar concerns in store-bought or common pizza you can find at restaurants. So again, sourcing starches and choosing proper cooking methods to really ensure the starch is cooked and doesn't contain a bunch of other nasty ingredients like PUFAs and preservatives is really important. But when you can kind of cook your own food and source starches well, we love starches. So let's discuss why. There are a number of benefits, in addition to them just being delicious. And again, our ancestors used them regularly. First, starches replenish muscle glycogen much quicker after strength training sessions relative to other carb sources, which improves recovery and enhances muscle growth. Second, many starch sources are nutrient rich, except white rice. And again, it's not a bad thing to include white rice, as consuming white rice in your diet provides energy value and is often very easy for people to digest, which is valuable for some people. It's just something to be aware of. Third, starches provide good energy, carbs, allowing us to get more calories in, which is a good thing. In fact, for many people, starches can really be the thing that helps them raise their metabolic rate relative to just including all fruit in their diet. Including starches can, it's almost like throwing logs into the fire rather than thin pieces of paper, since they're very energy dense, more calories and carbs per gram than fruits and fruit juices. And when that's burned properly, that can help reduce reductive stress in the cells better than sucrose sources. Another benefit is that starches are more readily accessible in colder temperatures, winter months, and they're easier to preserve over the winter. If you do not live in a warm climate, starches are kind of a must for dietary carbs in the winter. Another very important point is that starches are very important for progesterone levels and thus overall hormonal balance. So Dr. Katarina Dalton, she wrote a book called Once a Month, highlights the importance of starches for female hormone regulation and progesterone production. To properly restore the progesterone hormonal function, she had her patients eat starches at each meal. And the reason being, first, was so that cells do not become deprived from or run out of sugar. Here's a quote from Dr. Dalton, quote, "Progesterone receptors cannot transport or bind to a molecule of progesterone if there has been a drop in blood sugar." And the second point is adrenaline is kept as low as possible with starch inclusion. So again, here's another quote from Dr. Dalton, quote, "Progesterone receptors do not transport progesterone molecules into the nucleus of cells if adrenaline is present, end quote. So basically, Dr. Dalton found that the inclusion of starches helped optimize the body's natural progesterone production and kept the progesterone to estrogen ratio in proper balance. And we are bombarded with estrogenic substances in modern living, so progesterone is vital for truly everyone, including males. Okay, so what are some concerns of starches? For someone with a very, very slow transit time and low metabolic rate, they can get some stomach discomfort from undigested starch particles. Starches can be hard to digest and fully break down. Your body has to work harder to break them down relative to fruit and fruit juices, and thus some starch sources can move slower through the digestive system. Undigested food can increase inflammation and endotoxin load on the system and serve as a food source for bad bacteria. Here's a quote from Dr. Ray Peat, quote, "The upper part of the small intestine is sterile in healthy people. When peristalsis is reduced, for example, by hypothyroidism, along with reduced secretion of digestive fluids, bacteria are able to thrive in the upper part of the intestine. Sugars are very quickly absorbed in the upper intestine, so starches and fibers normally provide most of the nourishment for bowel bacteria," end quote. So there are some nutrition camps that bring up concerns about increased endotoxin load from starches, which is why you should avoid them. But some of those studies that they present are mice models where the mice ate raw starch. We don't want to consume raw starch. This is why it's pretty important to consume starches well cooked. And this is something our ancestors did. They went through extensive cooking preparations to really break down those complex starches, which really improves digestibility. Here's a quote from the literature, quote, "Salivary amylases are largely ineffective on raw crystalline starch, but cooking substantially increases their energy yielding potential," end quote. So when you cook starches properly, the digestive concerns of starches can be safely mitigated and is something that you don't have to worry about. Another concern about starches is that many grains and beans and legumes are high in phosphorus relative to calcium, like meat. Fruits generally have a better mineral balance, but just making sure to consume dairy in your diet or other high calcium sources like collard greens, this will mitigate any concerns here. Another concern is that starches are high in anti-nutrients, but if they're prepared properly, like our ancestors did, it will reduce these anti-nutrient levels significantly. And then the last concern is that many whole grains can be high in PUFA. So for those starches, just make sure you balance them with some saturated fat in the meal, like butter or coconut oil. However, if you use the following tips that we will include next, there should be no fears of including starches in your diet. In fact, we really think that finding a starch that works for you is really important. It's going to help you with better blood sugar regulation. If you just rely on fruits and sucrose sources, that may lead to bigger blood sugar swings, and you may have to eat more often. So here's some tips for including starches. We harp on this point a lot, but I think it's important. Make sure your starches are very well cooked in order to reduce the chances of fermentation of undigested starch particles. In the presence of heat and water, starch molecules absorb water and swell, and then eventually this swelling breaks the bonds between starch molecules through a process called gelatinization, making it much easier for us to digest. Second tip, eat starches in a balanced meal. And this can really help improve digestion for some people. So you can eat them with a little saturated fat, as the saturated fat has antimicrobial effects in the intestine to mitigate any potential persorption chances. So persorption is the passage of food particles through the gut lining. You don't have to go crazy overboard here with fat to experience the benefit. The second part here would be including a sucrose source at the meal. That can really help regulate blood sugar and encourage better liver glycogen storage and replenishment. Plus, as we mentioned, we more effectively use glucose with a fructose source since they have different pathways for absorption. The result is a higher rate of carb absorption and utilization. One pathway won't get jammed, so more carbs can be absorbed when glucose and fructose are absorbed together since they are absorbed via different routes. So you can add a little fruit, marmalade, honey, or maple syrup to a meal with starches. So the combo of a starch plus a sucrose source is also better for fluid delivery and gastric emptying relative to glucose alone. Another tip to mitigate the high phosphorus and low calcium concerns with starches is to just make sure that you're including a few calcium sources throughout your day to balance out the overall total phosphate levels in grains and ensure a good calcium to phosphorus ratio. So now let's cover a few notes about some of our favorite starch sources: sourdough bread, potatoes, sweet potatoes, white rice, cassava, oats, masa harina flour, and masa corn tortillas. Again, not everyone will do well with all of these sources. For example, I don't do the best with oats, but potatoes and sourdough bread are my jam. When introducing foods, start slow and slowly build up, adding some in. First up, the humble potato. Of course, everyone is not going to do well with potatoes, and if that's you, that's fine. You don't have to consume potatoes. But don't fear potatoes because an influencer used the scary word oxalate. Gauge your individual response. So the humble potato is jam-packed with nutrients. And did you know that there are indigenous tribes that actually consumed potato-dominant diets, like the Okinawans? So here are the nutrients in 300 grams of cooked potatoes. And this is from data from Chronometer. So 300 grams of cooked potatoes includes 60 grams of carbs. And yes, carbs are a nutrient. Our body requires energy, and protein is not an efficient energy source. And so here with potatoes, these carbs are largely starch, so pretty much pure glucose. So 300 grams of cooked potatoes contains 27% RDA of vitamin B1, 28% RDA of vitamin B3, 31% RDA of vitamin B5, 62% RDA of vitamin B6, which is actually the same amount of B6 per calorie of beef, 30% RDA of vitamin C, 56% RDA of copper, 19% RDA of magnesium, 23% RDA of manganese, and 38% RDA of potassium. There are also different types of potatoes, which can have different starch fibers, so it's worth experimenting which one you like better taste-wise and then which type you digest better. For example, Yukon Gold, otherwise known as young potatoes, versus russet potatoes. I personally like the taste of and actually digest Yukon Gold better than russet, but that doesn't mean that's the case for you. You can also experiment with different cooking methods as the fiber composition can change, for example, from boiling versus roasting. In general, boiling seems to lead to the best digestion, but I don't like to eat a ton of soggy potatoes or a ton of mashed potatoes. I like some crispy potatoes sometimes. So what I like to do is boil potatoes, slice into coins, and then meal prep that in bulk. And then when it's time to eat those potatoes, I will broil them in the oven to add a crispy texture element, heating it up. And so that just still ensures that the fibers are well cooked and broken down. So yes, potatoes are high in oxalates, and this is a big fear-mongering term that some people in the nutrition space will use. And some people can't tolerate oxalates well at this point due to their gut health. But to reduce oxalates in potatoes, you can 1, peel the potatoes, and 2, boil the potatoes, as the skin contains the highest amount of oxalates, and boiling potatoes is more effective at lowering oxalate content in potatoes relative to baking or roasting. Many people discuss how the skin is loaded with nutrients and fiber, but our ancestors really didn't eat the skins, and you get plenty of nutrients and fiber from the flesh itself, so don't really worry about that. Plus, it's well documented in the literature that if you consume potatoes with a calcium source, like cheese, milk, other dairy sources, or even collard greens, which is rich in calcium, you will reduce your absorption of oxalates. So this is shown in the figure on the right. On the x-axis is the calcium intake, and the y-axis is the oxalate absorption. So you can see that as your calcium intake increases, your oxalate absorption goes down. And the current state of someone's metabolism and gut will impact how well one does with oxalates. For example, the Oxalobacter formigenes bacteria in the gut, it breaks down oxalates. And this bacteria species can only survive in a CO2-rich gut environment. Many people have low CO2 guts due to lower metabolic rates. Plus, things like antibiotics and glyphosate could really kill off this bacteria species. There's also some data points to cases where endogenous production of oxalates, yes, your body can make some inside of you, has increased due to various vitamin deficiencies or other situations. I'm not saying that negative reactions to consuming oxalates don't occur, but the fear-mongering in the health space has gone too far, as people who may have not had any oxalate problems are now fearing any foods containing oxalates because of fear-based Instagram reels and influencers saying so. We need less food fear in the health space. What about sweet potato versus potato? Just want to share a few notes to help you better gauge what you respond well to, because the more food awareness we can develop, the less food fear we can have. I include both types of potatoes in my diet regularly, but the difference between potatoes and sweet potatoes is going to be the starch content, the nightshade, and beta-carotene content. So potatoes are a nightshade, which includes tomatoes, peppers, eggplants, and some spices. And some people at this point in their gut health journey can be sensitive to the alkaloid compounds in nightshades, but this tolerate level can change based on gut health and metabolic health. Sweet potatoes are also lower in starch and higher in sucrose. For example, 100 grams of boiled potatoes contains 15 grams of starch versus 8 grams of starch in boiled sweet potatoes. Orange-centered sweet potatoes are significantly higher in beta-carotene, which can be problematic for some people with a sluggish thyroid system. An orange-centered sweet potato contains 9,440 micrograms of beta-carotene, while a white potato only contains 1 microgram. It's energetically expensive to convert that beta-carotene to preformed vitamin A, and that can serve as a burden on the liver and gut when in a low metabolic state. Here's a quote from Dr. AP, quote, "In a low thyroid state, beta-carotene may fail to convert to vitamin A and can get stored in the tissue. This can lead the person to be retinol deficient and orange in color." End quote. Here's another quote from the literature, quote, "The conversion of beta-carotene, preformed vitamin A, to 2 molecules of vitamin A, retinol, is accelerated by T4, so thyroid hormone. So just something to be cautious of, and you will know if you're overdoing the beta-carotene if your hands and feet start to turn orange." White flesh sweet potatoes, otherwise known as Japanese sweet potatoes and a few other varieties, are significantly lower in beta-carotene and can be a great option. They also taste amazing. Not saying orange sweet potatoes are bad, but just monitor if your hands and feet start turning orange. That's just a sign that you're overdoing the beta-carotene. Next up, rice. So white rice that is cooked well likely has the lowest fermentation potential in our guts, and so it can work really well for those with compromised guts at this point in time. White rice is refined and stripped of its bran and germ, which increases its cooking quality, shelf life, and taste, while also reducing its nutritional value. That said, food is more than just its nutrient content. White rice can be significantly easier to digest relative to brown rice for many people and contains less anti-nutrients. One tip would be to cook white rice in bone broth to add some minerals back in, along with some collagen. Now, brown and wild rice can also be included in the diet for those that can digest these sources when prepared properly, soaked, sprouted, and cooked well. So various other roots, potatoes are technically roots, but other roots include beets, turnips, carrots, and parsnips. These are kind of more root vegetables that are lower in carbs relative to potatoes and cassava. And these are kind of more of a fiber and micronutrient source. Other roots include cassava, otherwise known as yuca or tapioca. And so this is a starchy root vegetable that's used in a number of traditional cuisines. The main difference is that while cassava contains both the fiber and the starch of the cassava root, tapioca starch is mainly composed of just the starch. Definitely want to be careful of the source here, as many pre-made packaged cassava products can contain a lot of gums, emulsifiers, etc. So try to use a pure cassava flour, which can make yummy tortillas. If you digest this well, be mindful of the source, as some sources can be high in lead, or just don't use it every day and you'll be fine. Cassava flour can be used as a flour substitute in baked goods if you really can't do gluten or sourdough or wheat flours. But again, gauge your individual tolerance and start slow. Next up, sourdough and sourdough baked goods. Sourdough is pretty different than modern, quickly made bread with yeast. White regular bread is leavened with packaged yeast. Sourdough bread is leavened with wild yeast and bacteria in the sourdough starter, which is originally just prepared from flour and water. Sourdough requires a long fermentation time, much longer than quick yeast-made bread. And this natural fermentation process of sourdough significantly reduces the amount of fermentable carbohydrates and free glucose levels. Sourdough bread also leads to improved postprandial glucose responses. Plus, this long fermentation breaks down starches and gluten, making it an easily digestible food. Rosello, a researcher, observed an increase of 16% in the sourdough bread digestibility and an increase of 18.7% in the biological value of the protein relative to bread made with baker's yeast. So this natural fermentation process required for sourdough baking also significantly reduces the level of phytic acid, which is the main anti-nutrient in grains, which will then improve the bioavailability of other micronutrients present in sourdough, such as magnesium. Plus, the longer the ferment for sourdough, the less gluten left in the final product, as lactobacteria in the sourdough starter start to break down the gluten in the flour. With some research documenting that long ferment sourdough breads can see a 97 to 99% reduction in gluten, almost making it gluten-free. Many people digest sourdough really well, but can have negative symptoms with normal bread. So in summary, sourdough is easier to digest. For some people, it has a higher nutrient content and better nutrient bioavailability. So I would definitely recommend trying out sourdough. But if you still don't do well with a real true sourdough, so some sourdough breads at the store can still contain yeast, so make sure you're buying real sourdough. Another question would be, for that sourdough bread, is the source organic grains? Sometimes the issue with gluten intolerance is actually glyphosate. So glyphosate is sprayed heavily on oats or wheat as a drying agent right before harvest, making grains one of the most sprayed crops. So using organic grains, in our opinion, is a must, especially if you don't tolerate non-organic grains well. And when it comes to gluten intolerance, you could also have a stressed digestive system caused by a state of a sluggish thyroid. That could be the root cause of the symptoms. Our cells handle and process gluten completely differently when our cells are in a stress state. In a stress state, there are many mechanisms that change how we function, and that serves as a protective mechanism. Increasing your body temperature could improve digestion and food intolerances. And then, truthfully, there are some people that really just do have an issue with gluten. However, things like rice, oats, masa harina, cassava, they may not be an issue for you. You could also go and try to find einkorn sourdough, since it contains significantly less gluten relative to modern wheat. And so you can try out that. It's a little bit harder to source, and einkorn sourdough is a lot more dense just due to the nature of the flour. For those that are sensitive to gluten right now, it can certainly be helpful in the short term to restrict consumption until optimal digestion and metabolic health has been achieved with a higher metabolic rate, and then slowly introduce, don't just jump right in. Next up, masa harina. So this is properly prepared corn flour to make traditional tortillas or other baked goods. So this corn has undergone something called nixtamalization, and this is an ancient process that involves soaking dried corn kernels in a solution of calcium hydroxide, aka lime, and water. So the result of nixtamalization of corn is that it significantly increases the bioavailability of vitamin B3, higher levels of bioavailable calcium, especially relative to most other phosphate-rich grains, meaning it has a much more balanced calcium to phosphorus ratio. Nixtamalized corn products contain 13 times more calcium than corn itself. Nixtamalization also significantly reduces the phytic acid content, increasing nutrient bioavailability. It also significantly reduces mycotoxin levels by up to 90%. Nixtamalization makes it easier to digest since the starches are pre-broken down. Tortillas made from masa harina flour contain less fat and fiber than the corn grain itself. So the term masa harina refers to the dried corn flour after nixtamalization, and then the term masa refers to the dough made by mixing the masa harina flour with water. So again, you can use masa harina to make corn tortillas. You can use masa harina to make baked goods like cornbread. And then you can find corn tortillas in the store. The only ingredients should be corn, lime, and water and salt. So when you see that lime, that means that the corn flour was nixtamalized. Next up, properly prepared oats. So a slower digesting carb that can be well digested for some people if it's cooked thoroughly. We would definitely not recommend eating these as overnight oats if the grains aren't cooked before or after being placed in the fridge. But sprouting and soaking your oats will lower the anti-nutrient level and improve the digestibility. And then, of course, cooking the oats will help break down the starches. Plus, the beta-glucan in oats can help some people improve gut health. Beta-glucan lowers serum cholesterol. So if you already have low cholesterol, you may want to minimize usage of oats, just something to monitor, because we don't want to dip our cholesterol too low. But as a note, oats do contain just slightly higher levels of PUFAs relative to other starches. So it's not something we want to overdo, like have for all meals, 3 meals a day, 7 days a week. But adding a little coconut oil or a little butter or some dark chocolate, which is rich in saturated fat, that will help mitigate any negative effects because, again, it's the relative ratio that's really important in a meal. So let's cover resistant starches. So this is a hot topic in many nutrition camps, and it refers to the types of fiber formed after cooked starches cool. Most starch particles are digestible after the food is cooked. However, some parts remain resistant to digestion by human cells. A type of starch that escapes digestion and absorption in the small intestine and is fermented in the large intestine with the production of short-chain fatty acids is called resistant starch. All starchy foods will develop some level of resistant starch upon cooling. For example, you meal prep a bunch of potatoes or rice and then you place them in the fridge. So resistant starches will form when the starches are cooling. But reheating those starches when you use those meal prepped items, that will significantly reduce the resistant starch levels when it's cooked, as those resistant starches go back to other types of starches. So for some people, resistant starches can pass through the digestive system unchanged, acting kind of like soluble fiber, and can improve bowel movements. The resistant starch can feed good bacteria if the good bacteria is there, and the fermentation can increase production of short-chain fatty acids to better feed the gut lining cells, improving their energy metabolism and thus improving gut structure and function. So for those with good gut health, their guts are rather robust to a wide variety of fibers. So the resistant starch can feed bacteria, good bacteria, and there really are no problems. But for others, resistant starch can wreak havoc on digestion. Reports of GI side effects include flatulence, bloating, stomach aches, cramps, and diarrhea. Here's a quote from literature, quote, subjects reported greater gastrointestinal symptoms during the high resistant starch diet, end quote. For example, Firmicutes and certain Clostridia bacteria may take advantage of this high fermentation burden in people susceptible to bacterial overgrowth. So if someone has dysbiosis, overgrowth, of course, excessive resistant starch consumption can cause problems. So you do not need to fear or stress out about resistant starches, but don't go chugging super green bananas and raw potato starch for the benefits of resistant starches. I put benefits in quotes for the quote benefits of resistant starches. You don't need to go out of your way to add more into your diet, but you also don't need to fear when potatoes or rice are cooled, because when you reheat those, most of the resistant starches is converted back. Plus, the better our metabolic rates and gut health, the better we can tolerate a wider variety of foods. All right, let's conclude this section with some important notes on starches. Note 1. If you're having digestive issues with starches, it's worthwhile to experiment to see which starch sources work for you, since they are very different and can have different effects on your gut. Some will certainly work better than others, and starches can play a huge role in improving your metabolic rate. So finding which starches work for you is important. Note 2. Your microbiome changes based on the type of food you consume regularly, so you cannot expect your body to perfectly digest a food you've not consumed in a long time. When adding in new things to try, start slow, like even 1 to 2 tablespoons per day, and then slowly increasing day to day while gauging symptoms and being patient. Slowly work your way up when adding in new foods. Note 3. For all carbs, we do want to prioritize easy to digest or well-cooked sources, because that can help pre-break down the carb molecules in those sources. And why do we want easy to digest food? Well, we have more cognitive capacity when our guts aren't expending a lot of energy breaking down food. Part of what makes us human is how smart we are. Our brain tissue is metabolically expensive. It takes up only 2% of total body weight, yet requires over 20% of our energy needs. And as humans, we have a limited capacity to produce energy. Of course, we can optimize this, but at the end of the day, it is capped. We can't just continuously produce more and more ATP. And this is explained by the, quote, expensive tissue hypothesis, end quote, in the literature. And this refers to the point that the metabolic requirements of large brains are offset by a reduction in the energy requirements from the gut. So if we compare primate physiology, for animals that rely more on harder to digest, lower quality foods, they have to use way more energy in their guts at the cost of their brain size and brain functioning. The colon is where food ferments, and the small intestine is where we absorb nutrients. Humans have small colons and large small intestines relative to other primates. And of course, larger brains. So again, the colon is where we're going to see a lot of fermentation. Our guts can afford to be much smaller than expected for a mammal of our size, and the energy freed up by these shrunken bowel movements can then power our energy-demanding and intelligent brains. So this type of reminder helps us better understand why proper preparation of starches and making sure we're eating well-cooked starches and easy to digest food is important, and why unripe fruits can cause digestive issues, as they aren't always the easiest to digest. And then the fourth note, so this is really important. The relative ratio between starches versus sucrose sources that works best for you will vary, and this is a variable we encourage you to experiment with. This can also be calculated as the glucose to fructose ratio, as starches will contain 0 fructose and sucrose sources contain both glucose and fructose. Some people can get really bad gut reactions on either end, higher starch diet or higher sucrose diet. This will certainly take some trial and error, but you can use the following metrics to gauge your tolerance: digestion and energy, sleep, body temperature, and pulse. You may find that some types help more than others to raise your metabolic rate. Remember, we want to see our body temperature rising after meals and trying to reach close to 98.6 degrees Fahrenheit by midday. So the goal is to find types and combinations of carbs that are prepared properly, that make you feel great and keep your bowel movements regular. So how you can experiment with a starch to sucrose ratio in your diet. Again, remember, starches are going to include things like potatoes, sourdough bread, cassava, masa harina, white rice. And then sucrose sources are going to be more like fruit juices, honey, maple syrup. So here's just an example. Let's say that you consume 300 grams of carbs per day. You could start trying an equal starch to sucrose ratio. So 150 grams of carbs from starch and 150 grams of carbs from sucrose sources. Again, just giving an example, not saying that you should do this, just trying to explain what we mean by the starch to sucrose ratio. And this can be tracked on Chronometer. So here's an example for the 300 grams. If you do 750 grams of potatoes throughout your meals for the day, that would give you 150 grams of carbs from starches. And then 5 to 6 cups of orange juice. This would give you 150 grams of carbs from a sucrose source. And you can sub orange juice for fruit or another fruit juice that you like, whatever works and what you have access to. Some people will do better with a higher starch ratio and lower sucrose ratio. and others will do better with a more moderate ratio of starch to sucrose, and even some people will do better with a higher sucrose relative to starch. One more example of how carb awareness can be beneficial is comparing different sweeteners. None of these sweeteners are bad. I use all of them from time to time. Raw honey is delicious and can contain some beneficial enzymes. Maple syrup is very mineral dense and is my favorite taste. And then cane sugar also contains some minerals. While they are all carbs, they do contain different types of carbs. So of course you may digest one better than the other. So honey's on the left, maple syrup's in the middle, and sugar's on the right. So honey, they're all somewhat similar to carb content. Maple syrup is going to contain the least amount of carbs per 100 grams. So for honey, it contains pure glucose and pure fructose, less sucrose. Maple syrup contains much more sucrose and less fructose. And then sugar is basically pure sucrose. So some people may not digest the pure fructose well in honey. Really, again, just showing this to provide more carb and food awareness. All right, that about wraps up the carb section. We believe that all types of carbs play an important role in health, and eating all of them can provide unique benefits. Just ensuring that we prioritize ones that we not only enjoy, but also digest well. And as you improve your metabolic rate and gut health, you will likely be able to add more and more into your diet over time. Part of a diet that is healthy and sustainable is variety. And that's the goal with improving our metabolism. We can enjoy a wider variety of foods, making this more of a lifestyle that is enjoyable and sustainable in the long term.